If you're CPU bottlenecked and are using an NVIDIA GPU, you're going to want to watch this video. If you're not sure, you probably are CPU limited, because most people in Tarkov are, and I'll show you how you can find out pretty easily. If you're in neither of these two camps, well, just watch it anyway because you might learn something interesting. In short, loads of people are missing out on a way to boost the graphical quality of Escape from Tarkov without sacrificing performance, or at least where it matters. I'm running a 5800 X3D CPU and a 4070 Ti Super GPU, so most of the time I'm CPU bottlenecked myself. It's best to show you this in-game directly. I'm running it on co-op offline because this gives you more control over the exact parameters, so we're going to be going in with my other PC. As you can see here, there's my other character, so we're going to say goodbye to him. And here we are. So this is what most people run. This is the default settings for the game, and I'll show you exactly what these are. This is my native res, which is 1440p, and people are using anti-aliasing with TAA high. This is the standard, and you can see that, you know, it's okay, but there's some blurriness. If you look around, you can see all this shimmering that's going on in the background. Lots of textures just flicker, even when we're not moving at all. The water is kind of okay. The bridge, it's really difficult to actually see these parts here. You can see there's lots of bits that just aren't rendering properly. They only render in a bit better if you're zooming in like this. This is the same for telegraph poles and all sorts of other things. So TAA is pretty universally hated across many places. There's even whole Reddits dedicated to hating TAA because of what it does. Exactly how it works is not really that important here, but what it does do is it makes things a little bit blurry by trying to remove some of the aliasing effects on the screen. So TAA is pretty bad, and the first port of call for me is to swap over to using DLSS. I've used DLSS for a long time, and what DLSS basically does, this is in this setting over here, and DLSS overrides the anti-aliasing. So what DLSS does, it takes a smaller version of your game, so it renders it in a smaller size, and then it upscales that to your native res. Now, if we go to quality, for example, what this does is this renders a version which is 66% on both directions, so it ends up only producing 45% overall as many pixels as rendering it native does. But what you get with this is you get partly the upscaling effect, but you also get NVIDIA's anti-aliasing along with it. So TAA stops being important, and you end up getting a different anti-aliasing instead, which is based on NVIDIA's AI and neural network. What this means is that even though you're upscaling, so you're using half as many pixels rendered in the first place, the picture quality is actually way more stable. So you can see the bridge, you can actually see a lot more of the lines. Out in the wild over there, yeah, there's still some flickering from shadows, but it's nowhere near as bad. The textures don't flicker anymore at distance and that kind of thing, which is the reason why lots of players, myself included, like using DLSS instead of TAA, because it just is a bit horrible. One of the advantages that you get for DLSS then is a lower GPU requirement, because what we're doing is rendering it at a lower res. If you take 1440p and you times that by 66%, then you end up rendering it in basically underneath 1080. It's actually a lower res than 1080 for the GPU. So it's as if you're rendering on 1080, but you're actually playing on 1440p. So the GPU has to work less hard, but why don't I get any more frames? If you look up in the top corner right now, I've got 115, 117, 114-ish frames. And if I swap this back over from DLSS, we swap this back over to TAA high, once it's settled down a little bit, we will end up with something very, very similar. So 115 frames again. So if I'm rendering in lower than my native resolution, why don't I get any more frames? Well, this is because I'm CPU bottlenecked. So no matter what I do to my GPU at this point, it doesn't make any difference. If we bring over the task manager, I can show you what this is. And there's way better tools for doing this, but you can see my actual GPU usage is not very high. Now that I've got into a windowed mode, it was actually down here. Now that I've got into a windowed mode, Windows is having to do other stuff, which is why it's jumped up to 50%. But normally when I'm running this, it's like down at 10% or something. But the CPU is only 50. So how can I be CPU bottlenecked if my CPU is only 50%? Well, here's where the trick is. Your CPU is actually a lot more complicated than your GPU, and it's not just one big block like your GPU is. If you go and change the graph to logical processors rather than overall utilization, you can actually see the different threads that are running and where they get limited. So for me, usually it is this first one, CPU 0 and CPU 2, that are causing the bottlenecks. You can see back up here when we were looking at it a minute ago, this was hitting at 100%. And that's the reason why this ends up being a problem. So my CPU is overall limiting what my GPU is actually capable of doing, which is the reason why when I change some of these settings to reduce the load on the GPU, it doesn't make any difference because it's the CPU holding us back, not the GPU. All right, so given that we've got all this GPU headroom left over, it would kind of be a shame not to use it. And surely there's something we can do to actually utilize that and make the game look better. Well, exactly, and that's the whole point of today's video. We're now going to look at the next piece of the NVIDIA AI magic, which is DLDSR. So this basically works in the opposite way to DLSS. DLSS takes a small image and upscales it using AI. DLDSR does something else. It's called dynamic super resolution. So it takes a very big image and then it uses the deep learning, the DL bit of DLDSR, to crush it back down again onto the screen. So now rather than rendering in some small scale and upscaling it, we're rendering in a bigger than our normal res and downscaling it. So this allows us to use our GPU's power much more effectively. How you activate this is through the NVIDIA control panel. If you look at the NVIDIA control panel here, over in the Manage 3D settings, in the general settings, you've got DSR factors. In here is the old versions. So this is legacy. These are called DSR without any DL. So this is just the old, like, pre-AI, no neural net one, which didn't really work that well. And up here, you've got the DL versions with the deep learning involved, which is the one that's much more efficient, as it says here. So same quality, 2 times more efficient. So here you have 1.78 times and 2.25 times. So the numbers here correspond to the total number of pixels that are going to be on the screen after you've done this. So 1.78 corresponds to a 1.33 increase in the number of pixels vertically and horizontally. Same thing for 2.25 times. This one ends up with 2.25 times more pixels. So that's 1.5 increase vertically and 1.5 increase horizontally. That basically takes 1440p to 4K. That's the idea. Once you've added these on and hit OK, and it will flicker around and stuff, this will then allow you to use these within Escape from Tarkov. So if you then go into the settings menu up here under graphics, this is my native res, but I now have unlocked 2 more resolutions that I didn't have before. I have 3413 by 1920. This is the 1.78 times, and 3840 by 2160. This is the 2.25 times. So this is the one that's going to utilize our GPU the most, and we're going to click that on. But the beauty of the way that these two things interact, if we turn DLSS on as well, this is actually going to render 66% less than what this is. So it's actually ending up rendering in our native resolution, because we're taking 1440p, we're increasing that by 1.5 to 2160, and then we're taking 66% of that off, and that gets you back to exactly where we started. So if we save and resume on here, now you can see that the graphical quality of the bridge in the background is absolutely insane. There's the minimal flickering that we've seen so far. There's still a tiny little bit, but that's just Tarkov for you. And everything looks so crisp and detailed. It's absolutely beautiful instead. Now, what has this done to our GPU utilization? This has taken it up quite considerably, but we do actually see a decrease in the frame rate. So before we were at 115, and now we're only at 85. So it does actually make a difference. There's 2 different settings, so you could set it to the one in the middle instead, and you can see where that takes us to. From 85, and that one jumps us up instead to 100. So you can now see that we are getting some graphical bottlenecking in here based on the resolution that we're picking. But this is only because we're playing offline without any bots. If you go to try this online, there's so much more going on that your CPU has to deal with that your CPU bottlenecked way earlier. Take Streets, for example. I went and did some tests using an actual online raid with a scav, and you can see that no matter what I do, my frames stay exactly the same. Now, the biggest problem with the way that all of this works is that it requires you to be in full screen mode unless you use a very special trick. So you can see here that I've got mine in borderless windowed mode, which is the reason why I'm allowed to use this in this way and flick about between them with no problems. You can't normally do this because if my desktop is set to 1440p, it won't let me set my game to 4K and just alt tab out, for example. It makes alt tabbing really awkward and everything gets a bit tricky. So here's where the next stage comes in. If we go back to NVIDIA control panel and we go to change resolution, what you can actually do is you can change your desktop resolution to one of these dynamic super resolution factors, so the 2.25 times. So my actual desktop is currently running in 3840, and I've got my screen set at 144 Hz. It does actually technically go to 165, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. So we can set this to 2.25 times. And the beauty of this is that then we can just swap around between all of the different resolutions without worrying about stuff. We can still alt tab out, which is really important to me when I'm streaming, and it makes the whole process 10 times easier because I don't like being locked into an exclusive full screen when I'm gaming normally, because yeah, if you ever need to tab out, the game just freaks out and it's prone to more crashes and stuff like that. Now, if you do this, it may well apply this automatically, but what I would just go and check is in System under Display, make sure that the scale is set to 150% for this particular monitor. So you can see this is because I've got a capture card, I've got 2 connected together, but on my secondary monitor, which is the one on the side that I'm pulling stuff from, this one is just 100% because it's in its normal res. But if you've got it on here, this normally detects it and does it for you, but because I'm running it in a 1.5 times per side resolution, it's actually increasing the scale of text and apps and other stuff by 150%, just so everything's readable, because otherwise everything becomes really, really tiny. There is a slight blurring on the desktop of text and things like that. It's not quite as clear as normal. But honestly, it didn't really take me that long to get used to, and now it just doesn't really bother me at all, to be honest. So it's up to you as to whether you want to do this with the desktop one, but this is the part that I was missing, which means that it's just way more usable. Everything doesn't flicker like crazy, and doesn't push all my other monitors apart when I'm opening up the game and stuff. This just makes it so much simpler. One really cool thing about this is that it actually also makes the icons and things way more clear too. Like, you can see the difference. If I go and change back to my native resolution, you can see the icons even look a little bit more blurry because they're rendering the 1440p versions of those icons. Whereas if I'm in 4K, the game doesn't really know that I have a 1440p monitor. That's being dealt with on Nvidia's end. So it's loading the 4K icons and then downscaling them to fit my screen. So everything just looks nicer. It also makes the cursor slightly smaller and some of the writing a little bit smaller too, which I think looks pretty neat. So this method is very cool and is most powerful when you are most CPU bottlenecked. The amazing thing here is that it doesn't hurt you in the places that you want to keep the most frames. I get practically no difference in frames on streets, no matter what I do to my graphics settings, which means that I can use DLDSR on the highest setting and DLSS with no impact whatsoever. Where you will see differences are maps like Factory and Labs because they have the least CPU bottlenecks and thus the ability to reach much higher frames than the other maps. This means that they're starting at a much higher base though, and I personally don't really care once I get above 80 frames, so I don't mind reducing from over 100 to 80 or 90 for an improvement in graphical quality. You can play around with it yourself too to see what the sweet spot is for you, remembering that there is a middle ground with the 1.78 times DLDSR factor as well. You don't have to crank it to 2.25 all of the time. With the borderless window settings, you can easily swap about between the different resolutions if you want to as well, depending on which map you're playing. One final note about screen capture, and one of the reasons that I didn't do this for a long time is that it's a bit of a pain when you're streaming on a single PC. Firstly, the capture sees the DLDSR resolution as the input res, so if you're swapping things about, it'll mess up your canvas because it'll see different sizes of screens depending on what you've set the resolution to. Secondly, especially in Tarkov, it will push your GPU much closer to the 100% threshold, which you don't normally have to worry about, and this can cause problems with encoding if you're using NVENC to do a stream. As I now use a capture card into a second PC, this just sees the native res of the monitor no matter what I do, so it actually loads easier. So as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.